I have worked transit adjudication at way station Ashen 7 for 11 standard cycles. I have processed 4.3 million arrivals, departures, and layovers. I have reviewed 890,000 cargo manifests, quarantine flags, and identity challenges. I have been involved in 41 formal detentions, 3 full security lockdowns, and 1 catastrophic hull seal failure that evacuated the Eastern Concourse in 90 seconds flat. I have watched species argue, weep, collapse, threaten, beg, and in one memorable case, spontaneously molt their entire outer carapace in the middle of Gate 11 during what they described afterward as a stress response. I say this not to imply I am a difficult person to rattle. I say it because I want you to understand the baseline. I have seen a great deal. And I still think about the human woman at Gate 7 more than I think about any of it. Her name, I would learn later, was Marin Solis. She was a press-credentialed freelance correspondent attached to no permanent outlet, which was common enough among the human journalists who moved through Ashen 7 on their way deeper into Cathari space. They came through in 1s and 2s, usually overwhelmed by the scale of the station, usually asking directions to the nearest translated menu food stall, usually carrying more recording equipment than their small frames seemed designed to support. I had processed 40 or 50 of them over the cycles. They were, as a category, curious, disorganized, and almost entirely harmless. I should say, I thought they were harmless. I held this belief in the sincere and comfortable way that you hold beliefs about categories when the category has not yet provided you with sufficient evidence to reconsider. 40 or 50 transits, a bit of confusion at the documentation scanner, the occasional translation flag for species-specific name formatting, nothing that suggested I needed a different mental file for them. That morning, and I use the word morning loosely, because Ashen 7 runs on a 22-hour rotational cycle that maps imperfectly onto any planet's actual day. But the first shift lighting had just come up warm, and the concourse had the specific low-energy shuffle of travelers who had been waiting since before the lights changed. That morning, I was at my secondary partition rather than my primary one. My primary display had developed an intermittent flicker in the left side readout, a maintenance ticket I had submitted 4 times without resolution, and I had relocated to the backup station adjacent to the Gate 7 corridor, while I waited for the engineering team to pretend they intended to fix it. The backup station at Gate 7 is a narrower workspace than my primary. The chair is not calibrated for Cathari body dimensions. It was originally installed for a Vethik adjudicator who preceded me and had a somewhat different thorax-to-hip proportion, and my upper processing ridge aches if I sit in it for more than 3 hours without standing. I mention this because it is part of why I was moving around more than usual that morning, periodically standing to ease the discomfort, which is why I was upright and had a clear sightline down the Gate 7 corridor at the specific moment the Vethik enforcers came in. The Gate 7 corridor is narrower than the main concourse. It services the budget transit pods, the smaller, slower, less comfortable berths that connect Ashen 7 to the outer relay stations, the kind of route that carries independent travelers, minor couriers, and lower clearance press passes. The ceiling is lower. The lighting is the cooler-toned standard rather than the warmer arrival hall grade. There is a single refreshment kiosk, a row of hard benches bolted to the wall, and at the far end, a transparent security door that leads to the pod platform. I had been at the secondary partition for approximately 2.5 hours when something changed in the background noise of the corridor. Not louder, different. A shift in the quality of the ambient sound, the footstep patterns, the idle conversation frequency, the small mechanical clicks of recording equipment and cargo scanners, that I would not have been able to describe if you asked me to, but that 11 cycles of standing in the middle of a high-volume transit environment had written into my nervous system as a signal worth attending to. I looked up. There were 4 of them. Vethik Syndicate, or operating with Vethik credentials. I recognized the resin-coated blue chitinous body armor they favored, the broad shoulder plating, the way they carried themselves with the particular forward lean of individuals who have decided they own whatever space they are currently occupying. The lead one was large even by their species standards. His primary carapace was deep blue-black, the kind that suggested he was past his third molting cycle, which in Vethik terms meant experienced, mean, and aware of both facts. The three behind him were younger, lighter in shell color but not smaller. They moved in a loose diagonal pattern behind him, not a formation exactly but not random either. Practiced. The Vethik Syndicate is not, technically, an illegal organization. They operate in the spaces between Cathori Compact, law, and the jurisdictions of half a dozen outer systems, providing services that range from legitimate freight contracting through to things I do not have the specific documentation to prove, but which I would be willing to describe at length to any enforcement authority who asked. They are not permitted to conduct enforcement activities aboard Ocean 7. They are not permitted to approach travelers in the concourse. There is a posted Cathari Compact regulation to that effect on every public wall in the station, available in 47 translated languages. The Vethik Syndicate was aware of this regulation in the same way water is aware of a low-porosity membrane, aware of its existence, largely indifferent to its implications. They had tested the station's response to their presence before. We had documentation on 7 prior incidents of varying severity. In all 7 cases, the Syndicate's legal representation had filed counterclaims of traveler misconduct, bureaucratic harassment, or jurisdictional overreach within 48 hours of any security action. And in 6 of those 7 cases, the subsequent review process had consumed more administrative resources than the initial incident justified. Station management had made the practical calculation that a visible syndicate presence in the lower traffic corridors, absent specific and documentable misconduct, was preferable to the administrative burden of the review cycle. I thought this was a poor calculation. I also understood that I was a transit adjudicator and not a station commander, and that my opinion on security policy was not among my documented responsibilities. I watched them move down the Gate 7 corridor. They passed a Thurvec freight broker sitting with his cargo scanner on his knee. They passed 2 Kelani academic exchange students with the matching satchels their institution issued, both of them absorbed in a shared display. They passed an elderly Korvathi matron who was asleep against her luggage. They stopped at the bench near the kiosk where the human woman was sitting. She was small. I say that not as a judgment but as a physical fact relevant to everything that follows. She was small even by the standards of her species, which are not themselves large. She had the short to medium dark hair that a significant number of human women seem to share, pushed behind her ears in what I would call a functional rather than deliberate arrangement. She was wearing a close-cut jacket in a dark neutral color, the kind with many pockets, the kind that journalists favored because it allowed them to carry recording equipment without a separate bag. She had a recording tablet on her knee, and she was doing something with it that involved frequent small corrections, editing, or filing, or some other task that demanded enough attention that she had not, apparently, noticed the 4 Vethik enforcers who had just arranged themselves in front of her bench. Or she had noticed and was choosing not to show it. I would, in retrospect, revise this observation significantly. The Gate 7 corridor has a particular acoustic quality at that hour. The budget transit travelers tend to be quieter than the main concourse crowd, either because they are exhausted or because the narrow space encourages a kind of self-containment. And so when the Vethik leader spoke, I heard the resonance of it without hearing the specific words. Vethik subvocal communication carries at a frequency that requires proximity to resolve into language. At 20 meters, what you receive is the tone, not the text. The tone was declarative, not a question, an announcement of conditions already decided. She looked up. That was the first thing I logged, without knowing I was logging it. She looked up in the manner of someone completing a thought before redirecting attention, not startled, not immediately apprehensive. She looked up from her tablet with the expression of a person who has been interrupted in the middle of something and is temporarily pausing to assess whether the interruption is worth engaging with. There was a brief, visible interval during which this assessment appeared to be occurring, and then she said something. I could see her mouth move. Her expression did not change from baseline neutral. The Vethik leader moved the arm that had been in a loose opening gesture position and planted it on the wall behind her, directly beside her head. A bracketing gesture. It serves, in most social contexts involving species that share a general body plan, as a fairly unambiguous signal. You are enclosed. You are my jurisdiction now. Whatever you thought you were doing a moment ago is suspended. She looked at the arm. She looked at the enforcer. She picked up her recording tablet from her knee, tucked it into one of the jacket pockets, and said something else. I want to be precise here because the sequence matters. She did these three things: looked at the arm, looked at the enforcer, stowed the tablet in that order and at normal speed. Not slow, as in deliberate theater of composure. Not fast, as in stress reaction. At the pace of someone performing a practical organizational task in a situation that has slightly changed. The tablet needed to be out of the way, so she put it away. That appeared to be the full extent of the calculus. The leader's mandibles widened further. One of the three behind him made a sound I could not precisely transcribe. A rapid kite-and-click pattern that in Vethik informal register is not a word so much as a tone. Amusement, or contempt, or both. They are difficult to separate in that species, and in my experience the combination tends to be the operational mode rather than either component alone. I had, by this point, stopped pretending to process cargo recertifications. My hand was near the security summons panel. It is a standard feature of every staff station on Ocean 7, a large amber panel that, when depressed, dispatches a station security team to the marked location within, depending on their current deployment, 3 to 6 minutes. I have used it 11 times in my career. I have used it for a Thervek freight dispute that ended in a thrown cargo crate. I have used it for a Kelani traveler who had a medical episode at my partition. I have used it for a Category 3 unauthorized access in the cargo loading bay, which is a level of incident that the station's emergency protocol explicitly ranks above what I was currently watching. I have used it, in short, for things less overtly concerning than what I was currently watching. I did not press it. I can explain this. I have explained it to myself many times since, in the way that you revisit decisions made under conditions you did not fully understand at the time. The first explanation I reached for was that I was watching to gather full information before escalating. That is a reasonable professional protocol. The second explanation, which I arrived at a few seconds later and which I find more honest, is that the human woman's body language was doing something I had not, in my 11 cycles of transit adjudication, seen a human being do while a Vethik enforcer was bracing a wall beside their head. She was not afraid. I do not mean she was concealing fear. I have seen concealed fear across 47 species. I know what it looks like underneath the surface behavior, the micro-expressions, the muscle tension, the quality of stillness that is actually arrested motion, the way the eyes process and exit before the rest of the body has decided to take it, the subtle anterior weight shift toward whatever space seems most available. She was doing none of those things. She was sitting on the bench with her jacket pocket now containing her tablet, and she was looking at the Vethik leader with the specific quality of patience that belongs to someone who has a great deal of time and is willing to spend some of it on this. I found this more unsettling than the Vethik enforcers. The exchange continued. The leader spoke at length. I judged by the duration, and the accompanying arm gesture pattern that he was establishing the terms of an interaction that was, in his framing, already settled. The nature of these interactions at Ashen 7, when they involved travelers who had not previously encountered the Syndicate's informal customs, typically proceeded as follows: an opening claim on the traveler's attention, a statement concerning a debt or obligation the traveler was allegedly unaware of, a resolution pathway that involved the traveler transferring a portion of their liquid currency or cargo rights to the individual making the claim, a secondary claim if the first resolution was resisted at a higher price point, a physical demonstration if the secondary claim was also resisted. It was not a subtle system. It relied primarily on scale, noise, and the traveler's assumption that whoever was in authority in this space was the person currently taking up the most of it. The system worked consistently. I had observed it work consistently on travelers who were larger than the Vethik enforcers, on travelers who were carrying security equipment, on travelers who had companions. It worked because it understood something real about how most species respond to physical compression and tonal authority. They recalibrate. They find the exit, even if the exit is compliance. The mathematics of the situation: 4 large, armored individuals, close range, a narrow corridor, the implicit weight of the Syndicate's reputation, produced a predictable outcome across the range of species the Syndicate had apparently tested it against. The human woman listened to all of this with the same flat patience, and when he finished, she spoke. She held up something while she spoke. A card. Flat, rectangular, the physical format press credential that human journalists registered with the Kethori Compact Communications Bureau. I had processed several hundred of them. They conferred within station boundaries a specific tier of protected status, not immunity from detention, but the right to be detained only through formal compact channels with a records notation. Practically speaking, they were a bureaucratic speed bump. They would not stop a determined Vethik enforcer from doing anything he intended to do, but she was holding it up as if she were demonstrating calmly that the card existed. Here is a thing that exists. You may wish to register its existence before we proceed. The Vethik leader looked at the card. He said something brief. One of the 3 behind him clicked again, the same tone as before but shorter, sharper. The leader reached out and took the card from her hand. She let him take it. This was the second thing I logged and could not name at the time. She did not resist the card being taken. She did not pull back. She opened her fingers and let the card go with the same quality of deliberate patience with which she had tucked her tablet away. As if each of these things, the tablet, the card, were objects she was setting down in an order she had already decided on, not concessions, preliminary steps. The leader examined the card, turned it over, said something to the one on his left. That one shrugged with the particular full-body chitinous roll that indicates unfamiliarity with the subject, which told me the second enforcer did not recognize the specific designation on the compact press credential. This was consistent with what I knew of Vethik Syndicate educational priorities, which did not heavily emphasize Kethori regulatory documentation. They operated in the spaces between regulations. There was not much advantage, from their perspective, in knowing the regulations precisely. He dropped the card on the bench beside her. She looked at it on the bench. She looked at him. She said one thing. He laughed. The Vethik laugh is a rattle and pop of the smaller secondary mandibles, quick, dismissive, carrying the specific register that indicates the speaker regards the previous statement as beneath serious engagement. The 3 behind him matched the sound a half-beat later, the way lower-rank members of a group calibrate their responses to the lead. It is a social signal that accomplishes several things simultaneously. It establishes consensus. It demarcates who is in charge of interpreting the situation, and it communicates to the target that their framing of events has been rejected in favor of the speakers. She picked up the card from the bench and put it back in her pocket. She did not look at me while she did this. She had not looked at me at any point. I was 20 meters away in a staff partition, which is not an obvious feature of the corridor to a traveler focused on the interaction in front of her. But I was, for reasons I could not articulate at the time, aware that she knew exactly where every exit from the corridor was, where the staff stations were, and where each of the 4 enforcers was positioned relative to her and to each other. The awareness was not based on anything she said or any movement she made. It was the quality of her stillness. The way a thing that has grown up navigating environments with multiple simultaneous threats holds itself when there are multiple simultaneous things to track. The leader moved again, not the arm-on-the-wall gesture this time. He stepped in front of the bench, directly in front, reducing the available space between himself and her to roughly the width of a seated person's reach. In Vethik social dynamics, this is a second-stage compression move. You are demonstrating that you can occupy their space at will, and you are waiting for the compliance signal that indicates they understand this. The expected response is a physical retreat, leaning back, pulling the feet in, an instinctive reduction of presence that acknowledges the hierarchy being asserted. She did not lean back. She put both hands flat on her knees and looked up at him with an expression that I, sitting 20 meters away behind a partition at a secondary processing station, found genuinely difficult to interpret. It was not defiance exactly. Defiance has a particular tension to it, a rigidity, a jaw set, an anterior weight shift. It was not that. It was closer to what I would describe, if I were writing a field report rather than a personal record, as threat assessment in the terminal phase. The expression of a mind that has finished all preliminary calculations and is now simply waiting for the external event that will allow it to act on them. I should have pressed the security panel then. I did not. What happened next is difficult for me to sequence precisely, and I have thought about this at considerable length because I am, by professional inclination, a person who sequences events precisely for a living. I process transit records. I track cargo chains. I file incident reports in chronological order with timestamps to the decimal. Sequencing is what I do. But what happened next did not proceed in the order I expected, and my attention was not, in the relevant instant, organized in the way I would have needed it to be to capture a precise frame-by-frame account. I can give you the before. I can give you the after. The interval between them is where my professional certainty fails me. The before. The Vethik leader at close range, reaching for the front of her jacket with his primary hand. Not the arm-on-the-wall gesture, not a containment move. Something more direct. The kind of grip and pull that communicates you are done waiting for compliance signals and are proceeding to the demonstration phase. His 3 associates behind him, spread in their diagonal loose formation, none of them at alert attention because none of them anticipated needing to be. After, the Vethik leader on the floor of the Gate 7 corridor on his side, his primary arm extended at an angle that primary arms are not designed to accommodate, his secondary mandibles working in the rapid flutter pattern that in Vethik biology signals acute pain input. 2 of his associates also on the floor, in positions that differed from each other but shared a quality of sudden arrival, the kind of positions you end up in when you arrive at the floor involuntarily and at speed. The 4th associate, the largest of the 3, standing with his primary hands raised to approximately shoulder height, and his carapace tilted forward at an angle that, in his species, indicates the withdrawal of aggressive intent. The human woman was standing. She had been sitting when I last processed her position. She was now standing, her jacket still in place, her hair in the same functional arrangement it had been in when she arrived. She was not breathing hard. She was not braced in a post-action stance. She was standing the way a person stands when they have completed a routine physical task, straight, weight balanced, hands at her sides, her attention moving from the 4th enforcer to the 3 on the floor, and back to the fourth enforcer with the deliberate sweep of someone taking inventory. She said something to the fourth enforcer. Lo, I could not hear it from my partition. I could see his carapace contract in the specific full-body tightening that indicates across the Vethik threat response register something very close to what a mammalian species would call alarm. He said nothing. She said the same thing again or something close to it. He stepped backward, once, then twice. Then he turned and walked toward the main concourse at a pace that was not quite running, but was everything adjacent to it. She looked down at the three on the floor. The leader had stopped moving his secondary mandibles and was very still in the posture of ground, which is what a Vethik individual does when their body has assessed all available options and concluded that being still is the best available one. She looked at him for a moment, the same flat inventory expression, and then she bent down and retrieved something from near his primary hand, her press credential card. She straightened, put it back in her jacket pocket, and picked up her recording tablet from where it had apparently ended up during the interval I could not sequence, which was on the bench where she had been sitting, undamaged. She walked to the end of the Gate 7 corridor, presented her credentials to the pod platform scanner, and went through the transparent security door. The door sealed behind her. I sat at my secondary partition for what my shift log would later record as 4 minutes and 11 seconds, without processing anything. Then I pressed the security panel. The response team arrived in 3 minutes and 40 seconds, which is within the stated performance window. They found the Vethik leader and his 2 associates in the positions I have already described. The 4th associate was located 15 minutes later in a maintenance corridor off the main concourse, sitting against a wall, and declined to give a statement. The leader and the 2 associates were treated by the station's emergency medical staff. The leader's primary arm required external stabilization, and one of the associates had a cracked secondary carapace plate across the left thorax, and then detained pending an incident inquiry. I gave my statement to the security supervisor. This took 40 minutes. She was professional and thorough and asked good questions. And when I described what I had observed, she wrote it down without particular reaction. And when I told her, I had not been able to sequence the interval between the before and the after, she looked at me in a way that I would not describe as surprised. "The human," she said. "Yes," I said. She made a note. "Where is she now?" "She boarded pod transit to relay station vael 4 extension," I said. Her listed destination was the outer press compound at vael 4 extension relay. The security supervisor wrote this down. She asked me for the traveler's registration number, and I gave it to her, and she ran it through the station's transit registry while I sat in the incident interview room and waited. It took a moment. Then she looked at her display for a second or two and she said, "Vael Prime." "Is that where she's from?" I asked. "That's what's on file," she said. "Vael Prime, Class-17 designation." She said it the way you say something that explains more than you intended to explain. I did not know then what Class-17 meant in the specific framework of the Cathori, Compact's biological hazard and origin world threat classification system. I work transit adjudication. My professional training covers compact regulations, cargo protocols, species-specific documentation requirements, and the formal procedures for 11 categories of security incident. It does not extensively cover the threat classification taxonomy for inhabited worlds. I looked it up after I returned to my partition. Class 1 through Class 8 are defined broadly as self-sustaining habitable worlds with varying degrees of environmental challenge, seasonal extremes, atmospheric variance, surface instability. Class 9 through Class 12 are what the taxonomy refers to as high-challenge environments, where the combination of predator ecology, atmospheric composition, geological volatility, and pathogen density makes permanent settlement by non-adapted species a significant undertaking. Class 12 is the most commonly cited in popular reference material, because several Class 12 worlds have been encountered and documented, and because the framing of Class 12, extremely high environmental lethality, predator ecology at near apex density, atmospheric chemistry requiring adaptation, is dramatic enough to have made it into the civilian literature. I had heard the phrase Class 12 Deathworld. Most working in Cathari Transit Administration have, at some point. It is used in the way that extremes are often used as shorthand for the worst case, the outer boundary of the scale. Class 17 is not on that scale. Class 17 is what the taxonomy uses when the existing scale is insufficient. The specific language of the Cathari Compact Biological Origin World Assessment Framework reads as follows in the relevant section. Class 14 and above designations are applied to origin worlds whose biosphere presents a challenge to unprotected non-native biological organisms that cannot be meaningfully quantified using the Class 1 through Class 13 framework. The defining characteristic of a Class 14 or above origin world is not the severity of individual environmental factors, but the systemic interaction of multiple independently lethal factors in combination, including but not limited to apex predation ecology, extreme atmospheric chemical variability, geological event frequency, pathogen density and mutation rate, ambient radiation gradient, and native megafauna pressure. Inhabitants of Class 14 and above worlds who survive to adulthood have, by biological necessity, developed adaptive responses to these combined pressures that are not present in the physiology or behavioral repertoire of species originating from Class 13 and below worlds. Class 17 has an additional notation at the bottom of its entry in the reference library. The notation is brief. It says, there are currently 6 documented Class 17 worlds in the cataloged galaxy. Of these 6, 1, Vael Prime, has produced a spacefaring civilization. Cross-reference, human species, Vael Prime system. Note, human individuals encountered in transit or commercial settings should be understood to represent the adult survivors of a Class 17 biosphere. This classification is the highest in the current framework. No Class 18 world has yet been encountered. The presence of a human individual in any security or conflict context should be escalated immediately to senior station authority. The notation was dated 11 cycles ago, roughly around the time I had started working at Ashen 7. I read the notation twice. Then I read the full entry 3 more times. Then I sat with the display off and thought about a small woman with dark hair pushed behind her ears, sitting on a hard bench in the Gate 7 corridor, waiting with flat patience for an interaction to reach the point where she would need to act. I thought about the taxonomy language, adult survivors of a Class 17 biosphere, not residents, survivors. The word doing what it needed to do in a single syllable. I thought about Marin Solis tucked the tablet into her jacket pocket and let the press card be taken from her hand, and sit without leaning back when the Vethik leader compressed the space in front of her bench. Each of those things, I understood now, was not passivity. It was triage, a real-time categorization of which elements of the situation required a response and which did not. The compression move did not require a response. The card taken did not require a response. She was tracking the progression of the encounter toward the point that would. The patience was not tolerance. It was economy. She was not spending anything she didn't need to spend. The security inquiry found no actionable violations by the traveler. The Vethik enforcer leader submitted a claim through his legal representation that characterized the incident as an unprovoked assault, and this claim was cross-referenced against my witness statement and the partial transit corridor visual record. The Gate 7 corridor has surveillance coverage, but the specific angle between the lead enforcer's body and the station camera created an occlusion during the relevant interval that, the Security Review Board noted dryly, was consistent with the enforcer's position being deliberately maintained. The claim was categorized as unsubstantiated and filed accordingly. The leader and his associates were released with a formal station conduct violation and a permanent enhanced scrutiny flag on their transit credentials. I continued working at Ashen 7. My primary display was repaired 6 days after the incident, which is standard for minor hardware failures. The Gate 7 corridor returned to its normal function within the hour. The Vethik freight broker went back to his scanner. The Kelani students reabsorbed themselves in their shared display. The Korvathi matron slept on undisturbed through the entire event, and the security response and the inquiry. And the refreshment kiosk continued to dispense whatever it dispensed to the travelers waiting for the budget pod transit. I requested a station reassignment out of the Gate 7 corridor 3 days after the incident. Station management acknowledged the request and then quietly declined to action it. I was told, in the message from the administrative coordinator, that staffing constraints made immediate reassignment impractical, and that my request had been logged for the next review cycle. I had worked long enough in the Kethori Compact's administrative structure to know that logged for the next review cycle was the institutional equivalent of setting a piece of paper on a very tall stack and closing the drawer. I told myself that this was fine. The incident was resolved. The classification entry said escalate to senior authority, and I had, 4 minutes and 11 seconds late, pressed the panel. The review was closed. The corridor was ordinary again. This was substantially true, and also not quite right in a way I found difficult to specify. What I mean is, the corridor was ordinary again in all the ways that showed. The visual record was identical to any other morning. The travelers were traveling. The kiosk was dispensing. But there was a quality to the ordinary that had changed, in a way that I would not have been able to point to with a single data point, and that I understood better once I had read the taxonomy entry a 4th time and then a 5th. 2 standard months after the incident, I was processing the morning's cargo recertifications when I received a transit notification on my secondary display. Inbound from vael 4 extension relay. Arrival at Gate 7. I looked up the manifest before the pod docked. Marin Soli's press-credentialed vael prime origin Class-17. Listed purpose of transit, continuing press coverage. Duration of stay, open-ended. Assigned gate on arrival, Gate 7. I processed her transit documentation in the standard manner. I flagged nothing. The flag nothing outcome was correct. She had no outstanding holds, no cargo to declare, no secondary verification requirements. Her documentation was clean and current and correctly formatted, which I would expect from someone who had been moving through compact transit systems long enough to know precisely what a properly completed press credential looks like. When the pod docked and the arrivals came through the gate, I was, for the first time in 11 cycles of shift work, paying direct attention to the Gate 7 corridor rather than my display. She came through with a small travel case and the same jacket. She stopped at the end of the Gate 7 corridor and looked at the concourse map on the wall, the same map, the same corridor. Nothing changed since her departure 2 months ago. Then she did something I had not anticipated. She looked over at my partition. Direct eye contact. She had picked me out of the staff partition layout in the time it took her to glance at the concourse map, which was either because she had a very good memory for station layouts and personnel positions, or because she had noted exactly where I was sitting on her first visit and had simply retained the information. I considered these 2 explanations briefly and then concluded that they were probably not mutually exclusive. I held the eye contact. She gave a small nod, not the formal acknowledgement gesture that several galactic species use, not the Kethori half-bow or the Vethik chin-dip or the Kelani palm presentation. A small, single, downward movement of the head, chin to chest and back. The specific gesture I had learned in the 2 months since I looked up the Class-17 taxonomy entry. that human beings use for mutual recognition between individuals who have a shared history they are not currently going to discuss. I gave her the same gesture back. I don't entirely know why. It seemed appropriate. She picked up her travel case and walked into the main concourse. I went back to my cargo recertifications. There is a thing that happens to you if you work transit adjudication long enough, which is that you begin to read the stations. Not just the numbers, the manifests, the arrivals, the security flags, but the quality of the space itself. The way a concourse sounds when it is running at normal operating temperature versus the way it sounds when something is off, before anyone has named what the off thing is. You develop a feel for it the way, I imagine, you develop a feel for anything you stand in the middle of long enough. 11 cycles, 4.3 million transits, the hull seal failure, the 41 detentions. What I noticed, in the weeks that followed Marin Solis' return to Ocean 7, she was stationed at the outer press compound on the Vael 4 extension, and came through Ocean 7 on her way to and from her filing destinations, was that the Vethik Syndicate's informal transit presence at the station had changed character. They were still there. The Syndicate does not abandon station access easily. The leverage it provides is too valuable. But in the Gate 7 corridor specifically, and to a somewhat lesser extent in the adjacent B concourse area where the budget transit pods staged, the particular flavor of the Syndicate's informal presence had shifted. The compression moves, the wall bracing, the long explanations of obligations the traveler had allegedly already incurred, these continued in other parts of the station. In Gate 7, they did not. I observed this over approximately 6 standard weeks. It was not something I could quantify precisely, because the Syndicate does not file incident reports, and their behavioral patterns are not logged in any system I have access to. It is an observational conclusion only. But I am, as I have noted, a person who sequences events for a living. I know what a pattern looks like, and I know what a pattern looks like when it has been interrupted. The interruption was not dramatic. There was no announcement. There was no second incident. The fourth enforcer who had walked away at pace and declined to give a statement had, according to the security supervisor's follow-up record, left Ocean 7 on the first available outbound transit following his release from the maintenance corridor and had not returned. The other 3 had returned after their enhanced scrutiny flags were processed and had resumed operations in their usual areas of the station. They had not returned to Gate 7. I asked the security supervisor about this once, sometime after I had formed my observational conclusion. We had developed a working relationship over the months since the incident. She was a Corvathi, which gave us an odd shared context given the matron who had slept through the whole event on the bench 3 meters from where it unfolded. And she had the quality of directness I associate with individuals who have processed enough security incidents to be done with unnecessary framing. Why Gate 7? I asked her. She understood what I was asking. Because they know who comes through Gate 7, she said. She's not there most of the time, I said. She's on a rotation. She's in the outer compound more than she's here. Yes, the security supervisor said. She looked at her display for a moment. Then she said, the Vethik Syndicate has a very good institutional memory. It's one of the things that makes them successful. They track which environments have produced costly outcomes for them, and they adjust their operational approach accordingly. Based on one incident, I said. Based on what they know about one incident, she said. She paused. And based on what they looked up afterward. I considered this. The classification entry, I said. The classification entry, she agreed. And whatever they have in their own internal files from prior contact with Class-17 individuals, which I would expect is also instructive. I thought about the Vethik leader's 2 associates, on the floor in positions of sudden arrival. I thought about the specific full-body contraction of the 4th enforcer's carapace, when Marin Solis said something to him from standing distance, quiet enough that I could not hear it from 20 meters away. I thought about the way he had walked to the main concourse at a pace that was not quite running. "What do you think she said to him?" I asked. The security supervisor looked at me for a moment. "I think she told him the same thing the floor told his friends," she said. I sat with that. It is a strange thing to work in a transit station that has, over 11 cycles, developed the kind of routine I have described, the long rhythms of processing, the occasional sharp breaks of incident, the maintenance tickets submitted and sometimes resolved, and then to have one of those sharp breaks produce a change in the texture of the place that persists afterward. Not large, not visible in any single data point. A subtle shift in the behavioral climate of one corridor, a pattern of avoidance that I could observe but not formally log, a small nod exchanged between a transit adjudicator and a human journalist coming through Gate 7 on her rotation. I have thought in the time since about what it means to move through the galaxy looking the way Marin Solis looked on that bench, small, unremarkable dark hair pushed behind her ears, jacket with many pockets, recording tablet on her knee. No insignia, no rank markers, no external signals of the thing she actually was. Coming from the world she had come from, growing up in the ecology that produces the only spacefaring civilization to emerge from a Class-17 origin world. Doing it in press credentials and budget pod transit, and the mild, flat patience of someone who has a great deal of time, and is accustomed to waiting for things to reach the point where she needs to act. I think about the Vethik leader, very certain in the beginning, with his primary hand extended toward the tablet of a human woman who was apparently confused, apparently alone, apparently worth half an hour of his crew's time on a slow transit morning. I think about the precise moment when the certainty stopped. I don't know what she said to the fourth enforcer. I can guess the shape of it, now that I have spent 11 cycles in 2 months and however many rereadings of a classification entry, developing a feel for the patterns of this place and the things that move through it. I think she said something that was not a threat in the way that Vethik enforcers understand threats, not a prediction of what she would do, not a declaration of intent. I think she said something that was more like a statement of fact about the situation as it currently stood, delivered in the same flat patient register she had used for the card and the tablet and the compression move, and all 3 escalation stages. A simple inventory of the present circumstances, offered for his information, in the tone of someone who found the whole exchange mildly less interesting than the filing she had been doing. I think that is, in the end, what you get from a Class-17 origin world. Not the ability to make a great deal of noise, not the desire to demonstrate what you are to an audience. The flat patience of a thing that grew up in an environment where anger is expensive and composure is the asset that keeps you alive, where what you are doesn't require announcement, because the situation will eventually provide the demonstration, and the only question is whether you want to be tired when it does. She came through Gate 7 14 times in the standard year after the incident. I processed her transit documentation each time. Her credentials were always current, always correctly formatted, always clean. She never stopped at my partition. We exchanged the nod on most transits, not all, depending on the crowd and her line of travel, and then she went on to wherever she was going. The Gate 7 corridor remained, in my observational assessment, a place where the Vethik Syndicate did not conduct informal transit business. I filed 11 maintenance tickets for the primary display flicker in that year. 7 of them were resolved. The station continued to process its 4.3 million transit annual volume. The Korvathi matron came through 4 more times on long-haul layovers and slept against her luggage on each occasion, undisturbed. I still don't know exactly what Marin Solis did in the interval I could not sequence. I know what the floor said to the first 3, and I know what the 4th enforcer did with the information, and I know what the institutional memory of the Vethik Syndicate concluded from the combined evidence. I know that the classification entry's final notation, the presence of a human individual in any security or conflict context, should be escalated immediately to senior station authority, is, in my now considered professional opinion, accurate but incomplete. It should perhaps also note, before the individual in question has made a move. After the notation is largely procedural. The situation, as Marin Solis had demonstrated for a concourse of 47 travelers, 3 station staff, and 1 transit adjudicator who would spend considerable time thinking about it afterward, had already been resolved. I should say something about what the Gate 7 corridor looks like on a first-shift morning, because I have described what happened there without giving you the context that made it possible, and the context matters. Ashen 7 is not a small station. It services 14 transit routes across 4 outer system territories, processes 3 significant cargo categories under the Kethori Compact's hazardous materials framework, and has a transient population, on any given cycle, of between 12,000 and 20,000 individuals. The main concourse is a considerable space, high vaulted ceiling with the layered transparent panels that allow the station's artificial light sources to modulate independently by zone, wide floor marked with the compact's standardized movement indicators in 14 species legible formats, display columns running arrival and departure information in the 11 most common trade languages with pictographic supplements. It is, in the way of working transit facilities rather than architectural showpieces, functional in a manner that has been refined by necessity into something close to elegance. The Gate 7 corridor does not have this quality. It was built in an expansion phase roughly 6 cycles before my appointment, and the budget allocation for that phase was not generous. The ceiling is the unfinished structural grade, the gray-beige of untreated compact construction material, which I have always found dispiriting, though this is a professional irrelevance. The lighting panels are the flat, cool white of low-cost installations rather than the warmer full spectrum of the main concourse. The benches are the modular steel frame type that the compact's procurement service buys in bulk lots, uncomfortable by design because budget transit travelers are not supposed to settle in for long. The capacity model for Gate 7 class pods assumes a turnover of 40 to 60 minutes per departure cycle, and the seating reflects this. There is, in short, nothing about the Gate 7 corridor that communicates authority or protection. It communicates economy. It is a space that says, you are here because you are taking the cheaper option, and the cheaper option does not include amenities. It is, functionally, the kind of space that the Vethik Syndicate has historically found productive. I think about this now when I think about what Marin Solis looked like on that bench. The corridor was doing everything it could to communicate low status, cheap transit, low budget, institutional indifference. She was doing nothing to contradict this impression. The jacket with many pockets looked functional because it was functional. The recording tablet was mid-tier press equipment, not the high-specification hardware that credentialed correspondents from established outlets carried. The hair pushed behind the ears was not a statement of anything. She looked in sum like what the Vethik leader had assessed her as. A small, moderately resourced, isolated traveler in a low-security corridor, exactly the category of target the Syndicate's informal transit system had been optimized to process. They were not wrong about any individual element. They were working from a completely correct set of observations and arriving at a completely incorrect conclusion, because there was one variable in their assessment that their operational experience had not equipped them to weight. The variable was where she was from. I have thought about this problem, the problem of visible versus real, more than is probably professionally necessary. It is not, strictly speaking, a transit adjudication problem. Adjudicators deal in declared information, names, credentials, cargo manifests, travel documentation. We do not assess what travelers are capable of. We assess what travelers have declared. If the declaration is accurate and complete, we process it and move on. But I find that I cannot stop thinking about it in the specific terms of that corridor. On that morning, with the flat, cool white light and the cheap benches, and the 4 Vethik enforcers who had made a very detailed and very reasonable assessment of the visible information, and arrived, catastrophically, at the wrong answer. The Compact's origin world classification system exists precisely because this problem is not unique to Marin Solis or to Gate 7. The taxonomy is a reference document, not a warning label. You cannot look at a person and read their origin world classification off them. The information has to be looked up, and in the informal transit enforcement model the Vethik Syndicate operated, looking things up was not a step in the process. The process was, observe the target, assess the relevant variables, size, apparent resources, apparent isolation, species familiarity, and proceed accordingly. The problem is that none of those variables are the right variables for Class 17. I have now read the taxonomy entry enough times to have the relevant section near memorized. Inhabitants of Class 14 and above worlds who survive to adulthood have, by biological necessity, developed adaptive responses to these combined pressures that are not present in the physiology or behavioral repertoire of species originating from Class 13 and below worlds. What the taxonomy is describing, in its careful administrative language, is something that does not announce itself and cannot be deduced from appearance. It is a property of having grown up in a world that kills most of what it produces, under conditions that the classification framework's authors apparently found difficult to describe using existing categories. You do not get to Class 17 by surviving individual hardships. You get there by growing up inside a system of simultaneous, interacting, independently lethal pressures and developing, at the level of reflex rather than decision, the responses that the system requires. What those responses look like, from the outside, in a budget transit corridor of a mid-tier way station in the Cathori Outer Territories, is a small woman with dark hair, sitting on a bench, waiting patiently for an interaction to reach the point where she needs to act. The Vethik leader had been doing this for, I estimated, at least 15 years, long enough to develop his own kind of experience with the way encounters proceed in spaces like Gate 7. The knowledge, refined by repetition, of exactly how much pressure to apply and in what sequence to produce the expected outcome. He was not careless. He was not operating on bad information. He was operating on very good information about a very large number of previous encounters, and the information had never included a Class 17. I think about that sometimes. What his 15 years of experience felt like from the inside, the accumulated weight of encounters that had confirmed the system, the confidence of a process that worked, and then what the interval felt like that I could not sequence from 20 meters away. The distance between certainty and the floor. He did not shout when he was on the floor. I noted this at the time without fully processing what it meant, but I have returned to it since. The 2 associates who arrived at the floor involuntarily and at speed, one of them made a sound on impact, the kind of involuntary sound that comes from a body absorbing an unexpected force. The leader did not. He was still. The posture of ground is a specific Vethik body language register that I have already described, the conclusion that stillness is the best available option. But what I mean when I say he did not shout is something underneath the biology. He did not make the sound that individuals make when they cannot believe what has happened to them. He was silent in the manner of a thing that has arrived very quickly at a complete understanding of its new situation and is in the process of accepting it. I think what he had understood, in the interval I could not see, was the same thing the taxonomy was pointing at when it chose the word survivor. The 4th enforcer had understood it faster. He was the one who had been standing when the interval ended, carapace contracted, hands up, backing away. I've thought about what he saw that the other three did not get to see in any useful way. He was behind them. His angle of observation was different, and he was watching from a position that was not directly engaged in the encounter. He had processed the before and the after with the particular clarity you achieve when you are not the one on the floor, and then he had made a very rapid assessment and arrived at a specific conclusion about the value of continued proximity. I respect the quality of that assessment in a way. It was accurate. It was timely. It was the correct response given the information available. The information was, the person you and your associates have been applying the Syndicate's full informal transit methodology to for the past several minutes has just demonstrated, in the time it takes to look away and look back, that the methodology was always irrelevant. And here she is, standing, inventory complete, looking at you now. He walked away. I think this was the right choice. There is one more thing I want to note, and then I am done with this account. Marin Solis was in the Gate 7 corridor for a total of, by my shift log's reckoning, approximately 22 minutes from the moment she sat down on the bench to the moment she presented her credentials to the pod platform scanner and went through the door. During those 22 minutes, she processed a recording task on her tablet, held her press credential up for a Vethik enforcer to examine, allowed it to be taken from her, retrieved it when it was dropped, remained seated while a large and experienced Vethik enforcer reduced the space in front of her to arm's reach, and then handled the subsequent development in the interval I could not sequence. Then she picked up her card and her tablet and walked to the gate. She did not look shaken. She did not look triumphant. She did not look at any of the other travelers in the corridor, most of whom were, by the time she stood up, watching the far end of the space with the particular fixed forward gaze of people who have witnessed something they are not certain they witnessed, and have concluded that not looking is currently their best option. She looked, as I have said, like someone who had completed a routine physical task. This is the part I find hardest to explain to people who ask me about the incident, and several people have asked over the months since, because transit adjudicators' talk and security reviews get circulated through the relevant administrative channels, and these things tend to become, in a modest and station-specific way, known. The question I get most often is some version of, what was she like? And the honest answer, the one I give when I am not being professionally cautious, is, she was exactly like what you would see if you looked at her. Small, unremarkable, patient, calm in the way of something that has decided, long before the specific situation in front of it, how much of itself it is willing to spend and on what. What she was like, underneath the jacket and the tablet and the press credentials, is not something I observed. I observed the surface of it, which was sufficient for the Vethik Syndicate's purposes in one direction and insufficient in the one that mattered. The taxonomy entry says the classification is the highest in the current framework. No Class-18 world has yet been encountered. I have occasionally wondered what a Class-18 would look like, on a bench in a budget transit corridor, waiting for an interaction to reach the point where it needed to act. And then I have returned my attention to my work, because I am a transit adjudicator, and the work is present and specific, and some thoughts are not useful to spend much time in. The Gate 7 corridor processes its transits. The Korvathi matron sleeps against her luggage. The Kelani students share their display. The kiosk dispenses. The nod when she comes through is brief and sufficient.